At this point, I think we can be as careful getting out as we were careless getting in. But we have to send a clear message to the Iraqi government, as well as to the surrounding neighbors, that there is no military solution to the problems that we face in Iraq.
Welcome back to Inside Iraq. We are discussing President Obama's plan to pull the major bulk of U.S. troops from Iraq with Ambassador David Newton, Peter Harling, and Adnan Pachachi. Adnan Pachachi, why should we believe that this provincial elections or the federal elections is going to change the political atmosphere in Iraq? Over the past 5 years, we saw Iraqi politicians, some of them corrupt, some of them sectarian, most of them they deserve to be behind bars, some of them they absconded with billions of dollars out of Iraq. So why, with the US troops and these elections, Iraq is going to be any different?
Well, you know, there has been a very strong backlash against the sectarian parties which control the government in the last 3 or 4 years. There has been bitter disappointment at the
this
failure of
backlash and this disappointment against religious-based parties?
Because they were in the government, they controlled the government. And many people who voted according to their sect are having second thoughts, and they are going to vote, hopefully, for parties that are non-sectarian. You know, I think the mistake which was made initially was to believe in a premise that Iraqi society is divided along sectarian lines. That is not true. We hope that these elections will rectify to some extent this situation, and the behavior of the politicians will be scrutinized by the people of Iraq, and there will be greater control, hopefully, by the people of the actions of these politicians.
We'll find out within a year whether...
If I could
Go ahead, Peter.
Here.
Go ahead, Peter.
No, just to say that at a minimum, I think these elections are going to introduce some degree of accountability. I mean, the past practices over the past 4 years since the last provincial council elections were held, in terms of corruption, lack of governance, the sectarian discourse, etc., have really made an impact. And there's a great sentiment of frustration at the ruling parties among the Iraqi people. So,
based on what, Peter, you would say that? Because accountability meaning somehow there is a measure of punishment, and many politicians, especially ministers, they have been found with their hands in the till. And when the Transparency Committee, what in Iraq they call Hayat al-Nazaha, pretty much charged these ministers, and even the Prime Minister says, my hands are tied, there is nothing I can do to them, because there is some sort of consensus we have to build, and those people are beyond the pale, beyond the rule of law.
Well, you're very right. The judiciary is probably the field in which the least progress has been made in Iraq over the past few years. But what I mean is, and what's striking in particular, is the fact that nearly none of the current members of the provincial councils are even attempting to run in these elections, because they know very well they have no chance of being re-elected. So even the ruling parties who voted in this electoral law, which to some extent advantages those ruling parties, have been obliged to revamp themselves, to run under different names, or co-opt a number of independents, and also completely overhaul their discourse and eliminate references to sectarianism.
David Newton, there is no way we can talk about Iraq without talking about Iran. And right now, many political observers, including perhaps the International Crisis Group, they think that Iran is a wait-and-see game right now. They're trying to figure out President Obama. Perhaps he might send an envoy and open a direct discussion with the Iranian government. Will the U.S.-Iran discussion somehow reflect itself either positively or negatively on Iraq, whether the Iranians can get away with their nuclear program or not?
With regard to Iran, we are going to have a different relationship, and we do have one between Iraq and Iran, and perhaps it's a more natural one. But I don't expect, especially the Shia, who now essentially run Iraq, to give up control of their country after they've waited decades to attain it. As far as the United States is concerned, I think there's going to be a great difference. First of all, I think this administration correctly will recognize that Iran, as a major state in the area, does have some legitimate interests and concerns, and I think there will be an effort to talk to them. It will be slow and difficult. I don't think we can just go in there and immediately start talking because the Iranians themselves have their own objectives. So I think it'll be a slow process. It's going to be very difficult, again, to deal with the nuclear issue. I think it's clear that both the United States and Israel came to the conclusion that a military solution is infeasible. But in the longer term, I think we can find some common interest. I think we can strike some kind of balance. None of this is going to be very satisfactory for the United States, but realistically, there are some things that can be done.
Before I take a response from Peter, let me go to Adnan Pachachi. I noticed that there was a major concern expressed by senior members of the Islamic Party, as well as occasionally by the Kurds. Why is it that the Kurds are somehow concerned, almost fearful, that the Americans are going home? And why is it that certain political factions in Iraq, those who do not have militias, are also concerned that U.S. troops will not be there to protect them?
Well, the United States forces, or rather it is to be called the multinational forces, really created a kind of safety net, really for those parties that do not have armed militias. The commander of the American forces in Iraq, General Nero, said the other day that the United States will have a role to play in ensuring fair elections. I agree with the Ambassador Newton, that the parties in power at present will try to win the election by using whatever influence they have.
My final question is to Peter Harling. Peter, not all troops are going home. The U.S. is going to leave a residual force. The most important question perhaps to be asked is, will this residual force will become a flashpoint for other military and militias, and perhaps even the Iraqi resistance say, pulling 120 is not enough. Every single American soldier has to go home. So projecting into the future, how do you see the impact of this remaining force in Iraq?
Well, I think that's still a question which is up to debate. I don't think we can project ourselves so far in the future for the time being. There's no doubt the U.S. will need considerable force in Baghdad around its own embassy to protect it, but having large bases elsewhere in the country will obviously be a source of huge tension. Now, just to go back to what the ambassador was saying, that I have no doubt that the ruling parties will have an advantage in these elections. They own the institutions that can help them push their agenda through access to resources. They can also intimidate. They have experience now in fraud, and fraud might be repeated in these elections as in 2005. Now, what I want to insist upon is the fact that a number of these parties reach disproportionate power in the provincial councils. In Anbar, for example, the Islamic Party had a near monopoly. The Shiite Supreme Council in a number of governorates in the south had huge weight in the provincial councils, controlled the governorates and the police forces. I think that these parties that have disproportionate weight will be, to some extent, cut down to size. So we'll see more of a balance, I think, throughout the country, both on the local level and nationwide.
Final questions to Ambassador Newton. Looking at Obama's involvement in Iraq, whether before his election into the Senate in 2002, after he became a senator in 2004, and during the run-up to the election, do you see a consistency? Do you see a very intelligent and wise understanding and comprehension of Iraq?
Yes, in general, I do. I don't think the statements, they reflect the situation at each time. The only one that didn't work out, of course, is opposing the surge, but he was not alone. Many people, including myself, thought it wouldn't work, and it hasn't worked so well politically. So I think he'll be very careful. We need to listen to the small words, like doing it responsibly and the fact that only combat troops have to go out. He does have some flexibility. The accord signed with the Iraqis is slower than his own plan, and there are elements of flexibility which I'm sure he will make full use of. He trusts his advisors, I think the generals in charge. We got in very badly. I think it'll be messy, there'll be still violence, but I think we can do better on the way out.
Ambassador David Newton, Peter Harling, Adnan Pachachi, gentlemen, thank you for being guests on Inside Iraq.
Thank you for having us.
You're welcome.
To access the show and to send us your comments, please go to aljazeera.net/English. We have reached the end of this show. Join me next week when we take another look inside Iraq. Until then, goodbye.